So, when I was 8 years old, um, I was in a car with my aunt and my two baby cousins. And my mom and my aunt used to kind of go back and forth with carpooling and picking us up from school because we all went to the same elementary school because we lived in the same neighborhood. And she picks us up from school. We're driving back home. We're about 200 yards from my house for her to drop me off. And out of nowhere, I see her head fly back. I hear a huge boom, and I see her head fly back. And there's just a sea of red that goes everywhere, right? Now, we're kids, right? And so every now and again, she would pick us up like a Happy Meal or something, right, for the toys and whatnot. And she did that day. So I thought it was a ketchup packet that had exploded and hit her in the face. I was 8 years old. Didn't know, right?
Well, brother, good to see you, man. We are at TRG in Dallas, Texas. Gino is in town for a We Defy.
Mm-hmm. We Defy Foundation.
We Defy Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
You want to tell us a little about what We Defy Foundation does?
Absolutely. So We Defy Foundation is an incredible group of folks that sponsor Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tuition for veterans across the country. So for veterans who are coming out of service, going through the reassimilation, reacculturation process, and looking to still hold on to that warrior ethos, right? The idea of maintaining that identity as they're getting into the Monday through Friday 8 to 5, right? To have a place, a home where they can express themselves combatively on the mat. They understand that, right? So amazing, the impact, the work that they're doing, over 500 gyms that they have affiliations with, and just impacting thousands upon thousands of lives positively, man, from a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu perspective.
That's awesome. Shout out to We Defy.
Yeah,
don't know you guys yet. Gino will connect us.
Absolutely.
And we're all about partnership here at 38 Challenge, so we'll make it happen. And I love it. Let's hold on to that point of warrior ethos, because I want to talk about that later. But so why are you involved in We Defy? Why are they having you here as a keynote speaker? Tell us a little bit about your background, your story.
Man. So I have been involved in the martial arts since I was a child, and first picked it up when I was about 5 years old and got into judo, and which is closely related to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And one thing led to another, a lifelong commitment as a martial artist. And I noticed, especially when I started to train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, when I got into my teenage years, there was something very unique, very different about it. And being a trauma survivor myself, I knew the impact of what training had on me. And I started becoming really good friends with guys and gals who were combat veterans. And I would see from the time that they would start to about 6 months in, there was a big shift, like a really big change, right? And like in the quality and the depth of their interactions, not just with others, but more importantly themselves, like a deeper understanding, right? And it fascinated me. So fast forward about 5-6 years later, doing my PhD at the University of South Florida. My doctorate degree is in a discipline called neuroanthropology. So it's neuroscience mixed with cultural and medical anthropology. So it's a very fancy way of saying I'm a behavioral scientist, right? And I focus a lot on the brain, right? Cool. So my fascination with grappling arts, judo, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, it never waned. And I knew that there was something else there going on cognitively that I wanted to explore. So I devoted 7 years to diving in deep and studying the effects that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu has on the reassimilation, the reacculturation, and the resiliency process for our combat veterans. And it was, man, it's my life's work. I mean, it's been an incredible journey up to this point. So We Defy got a hold of my dissertation. And their vice president, TJ Kreutzer, shout out to TJ, got a hold of me, reached out to me of all things on Facebook. He's like, hey, man, I saw your dissertation.
DMs, baby. It goes
you
down in DMs.
You better believe it. So he hit me up, and, man, we got into a phone conversation the next day, and we were on the phone for like 2 hours, right? I mean, it's like we had known each other forever, but there were just so many commonalities. So he had invited me out to a roundtable discussion with all the executives involved with We Defy, and had me present my work and my research. And it's very much kind of the ethos of what it is that they believe in, but I was able to provide, unbeknownst to me, by the way, like I had no idea that We Defy existed. but there was a huge overlap because it's what they do. And now there's some science to back what it is that they do. Right. And so there was a beautiful marriage that took place there. So this weekend, tomorrow, is their annual gala. So it's their biggest fundraising event for the year. So they've brought myself and my wife out for me to be the keynote speaker at their annual gala tomorrow. So
Awesome.
It's an incredible privilege and an honor. I'm really looking forward to it.
That's awesome. I look forward to connecting with them, because anything that can help veterans and warriors,
Absolutely,
we're all
man.
about. So why don't you dive into a little bit of what you discovered when you were researching in your life's work?
Yeah, man. So identity management, right? So like loaded term, right? When you start peeling the layers back on what makes up a human being, right? What fuels people to do what it is that they do, but then also be like fulfilled, like genuinely fulfilled and happy. And when you look at the camaraderie that exists in the veteran community, specifically the combat veteran community, those who have been there, done that, kicked down the doors, blood, sweat, tears, the whole nine, right? It's very special. There's truly nothing quite like it, right? As far as the strength of that bond that exists there. So, knowing that and considering that, there is a huge connection that exists as far as when you are forging, because it's a process of forging, right? Like you're beating out all the imperfections, right? You're being able to have a deeper understanding of what your true capabilities and your potential are as a human being. So when you can get to a place where you understand that there is the identity portion of the warrior ethos, it transcends everything, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be in uniform. It doesn't mean you need to be deployed. You can carry that spirit with you anywhere that you go, right? But it's just being equipped with the confidence, right? And so and I always break this down. What is confidence, right? Well, confidence comes from confide in Latin, right? With faith. Faith in what? Yourself, that belief in yourself. So it's not just about, I've got my team or we're getting ready to go do this particular raid or this particular mission on a nighttime. It's no, within me, right? When I come back home as a civilian and I've got my tribe of folks that I need to take care of, right? How is it that I can push myself to the best and highest use as a human being to be able to achieve greatness and excellence, right? Well, greatness and excellence because you are a warrior. You are a warrior. You don't ever lose that, right? But so many folks from an identity management perspective, they get lost because they don't feel like it will transcend, it will translate, and it does, right? And that's one of the beautiful things about jiu-jitsu is that it allows them to do that, right? And so identity management is a really, really big thing when it comes to that component. The other side of it, right, there's a trifecta. Obviously, there's a physical side, a mental side, and a social side, right? So bare bones on the neuroscience portion of it. The physical side, okay, so we have what's called the HPA axis, right? Your hypothalamus, your pituitary, and your adrenal glands. That controls your stress response system, right? So, your epinephrine, norepinephrine, cortisol, all that stuff. When you hit fight, flight, or freeze, bam, like that stuff is rocking and rolling, right? So, like anything, if I'm deployed out and I'm in a military environment, when fight or flight kicks in, right, I can burn those neurohormones off. Well, now think of that feeling and that response, and now take that into someone who's working a Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and they're in a cubicle, right? And they're super stressed out because they're not making enough money to clear the mortgage, or, kids got soccer tuition coming, we got to pay for it, whatever it is, right? It's the same response that's kicking off. There's different degrees of it, but you're going through that same neural circuitry, right? And so there is no outlet, there is no release, because here you are confined to this chair in front of a computer screen. And when you're used to feeling like that, you do something about it. Now you can't do anything about it, right? It's all up here.
Right.
And so then we start talking about the resiliency piece, right? And so the physical release, super important. Now, the interesting thing about that is it's
the physical, so responding to those ways in a physical manner rather than manifesting it at the desk that turns into stress.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
I mean, is there a difference between that release in jiu-jitsu compared to someone just like cranking out weights at the gym? Or are we talking about similar things here?
So it's similar, right? It's similar. The difference is the nature in which it's actually being procured, right? What do I mean by that? If I go to the gym, right, and I'm lifting weights and I'm getting a great, lift in, and I've got a good pump, and I start to feel those endorphins, right? And I'm like, oh, this is great. I feel the burn. That's one thing. But when I start to feel that and I'm under pressure because you're trying to strangle me or you're trying to rip my arm off.
That was going to be my question, yeah.
It puts you in a whole different state of, dude, you better figure something out,
Right.
right? While being under this stress, very similar to combat.
That's super interesting. That's super, and it in a way, it's like the same thing as meditation, in a way. But like, I guess the reason for doing it would be the same, right? How are you reacting under stressful circumstances?
Bingo.
When you're lifting weights, you're blocking everything out.
That's exactly
You're listening
right.
to music, but when you're in jiu-jitsu, you have to think on your feet, and you can't just like, sure, your endorphins are raised and your adrenaline is up, but you also have to think through that situation rather than just being in the weight room. It's very interesting.
And it's also dependent on someone else, right? Lifting weights I can do anytime by myself, right? But when you start, jiu-jitsu doesn't work unless you have somebody else, right? I could, roll with a training dummy all day, right? But it's nowhere near the same sentiment, right? I could get reps and drills and that's fine. But it is a whole different ball game when it's one individual and another individual, and you're trying to impose your respective wills on one another.
It's interesting. So for the 38 challenge, we say that the way that you suffer, the way that your wife suffers, the way that Lucas, our producer suffers, the way that I suffer, it's all different. The beautiful thing about suffering is it looks different to everyone. But the only thing we say, so that's why that's 38 challenge. People can create their own 38-minute exercise, but we say the only thing you can't do is suffer by yourself. You have to. So I always say you have to go go do a 38 challenge with someone, because that means that you're leaning on someone. You're building that connection. It sounds like it's the same thing with jiu-jitsu.
100%, right? And that's the interesting thing about it too, right? So you start talking about the social bonds that are created on the mat, right? So for example, you and I are rolling, right? You take my back and you get me in a rear naked choke. Well, in a very real sense, right? You have the power and the ability to kill me, right? I mean, if you hold that choke long enough and you don't respect the tap, right? Dude, that's a really bad day for me, right? So that trust factor, right? Which so many of our guys and gals don't feel, right? The people that are around them in the work environment, even at home, they can't relate. They can't understand. They don't get it. But then again, I can go to this institution 2 or 3 days a week where our relationship, we don't have to talk, right? We just get on the mat and we understand what's going on, and we're speaking the same language, and even though we're strangling and choking each other, right? We're still creating an incredible bond of trust, because when I tap, you know to let go, right? And vice versa. So that give and take, when you start talking about rekindling social relationships, rebuilding what it means to trust somebody, it reshapes everything.
Yeah, man. There's a quote, I heard it in a podcast with Brene Brown and Simon Sinek, and it says it was a definition of love, and the definition, I probably won't say it word for word, but they switched the word love and vulnerability, and it's that vulnerability is giving someone the power to destroy you, but trusting that they're not going to use it, and that's basically just exactly what you just explained in jiu-jitsu.
It's exactly what it is, and that's actually a beautiful definition of it.
Yeah, it really is.
Because when you really start peeling the layers back on what it means to give someone else that power, right? When you are used to keeping it and holding it tight to the chest, it's impossible to create authentic trust with someone unless you are willing to truly be vulnerable and 100% naked with them, right? Because at the end of the day, that is what combat is, right? That baptism by fire, I am depending on the guy to my left and to my right to save my ass, right? And vice versa, right? We're going to get through this together, right? So as a civilian, where do you find that, right? That's where the challenging part comes into play. You've got wonderful organizations that are out there that do incredible work, that are helping our veterans, right? To build that resiliency, to be able to live a fulfilling life, right? Post-service. But when you look at the mediums, right, that exist, that are socially acceptable, right, and also endorsed as a sport, right, where we can go and give 100%, because here's another thing. Combat sports in general, boxing, right? Well, if you and I get into a ring and we go 100%, we're going to get hurt. Like you get busted mouth, busted
and
nose.
And that's another thing is, so I also run the military programs for the Concussion Legacy Foundation. So we're focused very much on brain injuries. Yeah. And jiu-jitsu, you're not banging heads.
Exactly.
Right? So I think that is a combat sport that I could get behind without getting in trouble with my I boxed for 4 years. Yeah. And I love boxing. I won't spar anymore. Yeah. But I'm interested in getting into jiu-jitsu now because and I have been, but I'm already convinced I'm going to start after these next after these 38 days of 38 challenge.
You're pumping me up over here, man. I'm amped for you.
Yeah, dude, let's do it, bro. Lucas is pointing at me. He wants to do it too.
Come on, man. Let's do a trifecta.
Yeah, no, you're not going to tap me out. We're going to be rolling around in the office, just getting nothing done. All right, so Art can already tell us it's going to be an amazing conversation. Why don't you finish the third part, which is resiliency.
So physical, mental, social, and then the resiliency side, right? So resiliency, and this is a term for in multiple circles, right? Has become very popular in the past, call it 15 years, right? Post OIF and OEF, there's been obviously a lot of challenges, a lot of issues with understanding truly how do you implement and instill resiliency in a fighting force. A lot of good theories, right? But at the end of the day, the dependency factor on the other person, right? And what it means, to your point earlier, to have that vulnerability to trust the other person. And when you forge that resiliency, which for me, what is the definition of it? In a very simple term, it's mental toughness, right? This idea of, well, what does it mean to be tough? Well, can you withstand the storm? Well, what does it take to withstand the storm, right? Are you firmly planted? Do you have a strong foundation in your belief systems and who you are? Do you have a strong foundation in the trust to the people to your left and to your right? Do you have a strong foundation for what it is that you want to go achieve, right? All of these things that require a massive component, going back to identity management. Who are you? Do you know who you are and what your purpose is? And so when you lose sight of that because you no longer have that intentful purpose, because you're not in an environment that's testing that metal, right? It's life or death. I tell folks all the time, like if you think of, as civilians, you're driving on the interstate, right? Cop gets behind you, lights you up, right? That feeling you get like, oh, uh-oh, was I speeding? Am I riding dirty? Like, is there something going on, right?
Yeah.
That feeling that you get in the pit of your stomach, there's a reason that it's there, right? It's an evolutionary response that's thousands of years old that kept us safe from Tyrannosaurus Rex and saber-toothed tigers, right? When in reality, right, it's a cop that's pulled behind you who's probably going to give you a warning or give you a ticket and you're going to be on your way going home. Like, no big deal, right? But our minds, right, they go into an incredibly deep, deep pocket of possibilities of what could be, right? And that's dangerous, right? Because then you start talking about ambiguity. So bringing it back to resiliency on the mental toughness side, when you have a strong foundation and you have a deep understanding of who you are, what you stand for, and what your purpose is, that provides the initial pillars, right? Because then after that, it's a question of choices, right? And the discipline you have to make the right choices to maintain it, because you can get to a baseline, but how do you maintain it? And that's where it gets really, really tough, right? But it's the constant struggle of, maintaining balance in what you do on a day in, day out basis. It's hard. It's not easy.
So, and I always struggle because people come to me and they'll say, like, you have this passion, you have this purpose, right? And I tell them, and a lot of people are like, I don't have my passion, I don't have my purpose. But the reason why I have my passion, the reason I have my purpose is because my best friend and my brother, the man I looked up to the most in life, shot himself in the head. Like, that is why I have my purpose. So so when people ask me, like, I don't have my purpose, I say, you don't want my purpose. Because that means that you're the person that's closest to you in your life. It means them taking their life.
Absolutely.
So what is your response when when they think that they don't have a purpose? Because I truthfully, sometimes my answer, and it's probably not right, is just, I tell them, work hard, right? Do the things that you need to be doing to be a good person and create the person who you want to be, and then your purpose will reveal itself. That's my advice. I don't know if it's good advice. I'm not saying that it's great advice. It's just what I tell people. So if someone asked you, how do they find their purpose, or what is their purpose? What do you say?
That's a great question. One of the things that I drive home a lot with folks that I have the opportunity to work with in this particular topic is, let's just start off with a baseline, right? Who are you? Let's have that conversation first, right? And what I typically have them do is I'll have them write their own constitution, right? So I want you to sit down with a blank sheet of paper and you tell me everything that you stand for and everything that you believe in, right? So let's start there, because if I were to ask most folks what their belief system is, right, most folks would have a response. They'd have an answer, right? Okay. Right. So when you start looking at that and you have a constitution that is written out that defines you as an entity, as a person, and then you start looking at, okay, so what do I actually do day in and day out? And is it a reflection of what's on that paper? And it's amazing, because most people will say, I don't know what my purpose is. There's a big contradiction between what's on that paper and what they choose to do every single day. So the power of choice, right?
Yeah.
And being able to understand that, why are you doing what you're doing? Because if you don't understand the why, it's pointless, right? You're just going through the motions.
For sure.
And that's why there's so much noise up here and you can't find your purpose, right? And so for folks like you and I who've gone through that kind of trauma right before, it cuts the noise out really fast, because it's literally, it stains your soul, like it does, right? Like the cut is deep,
There's like, and that's the thing. It's difficult for me to relate to people on that part. First of all, because I don't want to relate to people on that part. It's like you don't want to relate in this. But also, it's like my purpose was one phone call that I got.
Yeah,
and it was the worst phone call of my life.
Absolutely.
So, but I love that point, and to make that reflection, to write down your constitution and think about who it is that you are. That takes vulnerability too.
Big time.
It takes a lot of self-reflection, and it takes a lot of hard questions to be answered. Absolutely. That you have to have the ability to ask yourself.
Without a doubt, man. Without a doubt. So that's the foundational component behind it, right? Because whenever you have them cross-reference between what's on paper and the choices that they make on a daily basis, which, when you take a look at choices and then habits to behavior, I mean, dude, that's kind of the way in which we as human beings operate, right? It's all based off of simple choices that lead to bigger choices. And if they're not a reflection of your belief system, right, and you're doing it because someone else told you to do it, but you don't understand why, well, you are adding in doses of ambiguity because you don't actually believe that, right? And it's a bit confusing, but hey, I have to do it because it's my job, right? Or so-and-so told me to do so. No, you don't, right? But it takes a level of courage, right, to firmly plant yourself and say no, right? And so when people can start doing that, they start finding that North Star.
Right.
And when you can find that North Star, you don't care.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
you just
yeah.
Whatever. Like if you think that that's what your truth is, then that's on you. But I can tell you right now, from my experience and what I have seen and what I have lived from an authenticity perspective, off base, man. Right. But that's the nature of it, though.
For sure. So to you, resiliency means mental toughness.
Yes.
And you described mental toughness a little bit. Why don't you go a little bit more? Because when I think we had an interesting conversation the first time we spoke on mental toughness, and I think when you hear the word mental toughness, you think these SEALs that are, which is not a wrong definition. There needs to be that. I think that's a very important point to make. So you need to have discipline, and you need to have the courage and the will to do hard shit. So, but it's also it can get dangerous because it scares people away, and like people think that being mentally tough is like waking up at 4 a.m, working yourself into the ground, but they don't address the part of being mentally tough, which is being vulnerable.
That's right.
So how would you describe mental toughness in that fashion?
So it's a huge point that you just raised, right? And there's a massive correlation between mental toughness and vulnerability. And a lot of people don't make the correlation, right? Because it's not just about this idea of having the grit to push through, the intestinal fortitude to push through. It's about being mentally tough on myself and saying, hey, you're starting to redline on the emotional side of things, on the spiritual side of things. You need to check yourself, right? And so that takes a deeper understanding to even know, right, what my boundaries are. Because if I don't even know, it's a problem.
And that's way harder.
Oh my gosh.
That's what. So, the last, I guess I'm on day 25 now. I've been doing since beginning of September. I decided I'm going to do every day. I'm going to do 38 days straight of the 38 challenge. Yeah. Which is, for the listeners who don't know what the 38 challenge exercise is, it's 400 meters around the track.
Beast mode.
38 push-ups, 38 sit-ups, 38 squats.
Yeah.
And you do as many rounds as you can in 30 minutes. So every day you're running a couple miles, you're doing an exuberant amount of push-ups, sit-ups, and squats. Yeah. In the first couple weeks, I was not enjoying it because it sucks every time, but I'm at a point now where it's like I absolutely hate doing the workout. I absolutely hate it. At the same time, I said I was going to write down, I wrote down 38 names of people I was going to call and check in and have difficult conversations on them. I have not missed a day of the exercise. I have missed multiple days of not calling people. And that's that red line that I'm walking. Is like if you are who you say you are and you are being vulnerable, right, and you're checking in on people. But what I've learned is that part's harder. The physical part is not the hard part.
No,
and you can build that. You can build the grit of doing hard shit physically on your body way easier than you can build the mental toughness it takes to pick up the phone and have difficult conversations.
Hands down, 100% correct. And when you take a look at why is it harder? Why is it the harder choice? When you tell your body do this, and you may feel lazy, you may not want to do it, but once you start doing it, you start rolling, right?
Right.
Well, with your mind and your brain, it's it's a little bit different because you are, in a very real sense, you are pushing yourself to create new neurocircuitry, right? So like this concept of neuroplasticity, right? Where like neurons that fire together wire together, right? Well, if I am pushing myself to think about my emotional bandwidth, right? My spiritual bandwidth, my interactions with others from a physical, mental, and a social perspective. If I don't have a very clear bearing on what those boundaries are, right? Within each three of those domains, it's very easy to get off kilter and be offline, man. Like it happens to all of us, right? Every single person,
Right.
It's a thing. But having the awareness to know, like, okay, hold on. If you're legit, right? If you're being authentic with yourself and things line up, you're gonna make it's still gonna be hard, like, but you understand that there's a bigger reason why you're doing it, and it's part of those defining pillars in your identity, right? And that's the thing. There's so much noise that's going on today, right? I mean, like, dude, social media, technology, stress for folks in general, right? And that's the population at large. We're not even mentioning our veteran population. Everything that they're trying to make sense of, whether it's loss, trauma, issues and adversities at home or relationships with friends, it's amplified. It exponentiates.
Yeah, and the fact that they have to deal with these transition, the trauma, coming back into society with a brain that is likely injured.
Oh, without a doubt.
If your brain is not functioning how it should be, then you also can't process the trauma that you've experienced.
That's exactly right.
In the way that a normal person with a brain who's not injured would be, someone with a normal brain, and it's because of the service that they've and the sacrifices that they made for this country.
Well, it's an interesting point too, right? Because when you look at specific components in the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, right, or the hippocampus, when you start talking about, like, for example, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, and this idea of self-actualization, which is kind of the field we all play in because all of our basic needs in a first world country, they're met, right? Like from the majority of us, right, they're met.
Right.
So when you get past those certain levels and now you start talking about being able to process deeper thoughts, like being able to understand your identity, being able to understand it's not just about survival or having food and water and shelter. Now it's, what's my purpose? Like I have the time, I have the bandwidth to do that. And if I have damage, like biological damage done, physiological damage done,
yep,
man, that's tough. Like that's really, really tough. But the beautiful thing about the brain, and we've recently found this, I'd say probably in the past 5 or 6 years. So neurogenesis used to be a thing as far as like creating new neurons. It was thought that once you're done with adolescence in like your early 20s, you can't do it anymore, right? Well, that's actually a fallacy, right? You can. It's very difficult. You have to continuously make the harder choice to create those new neural pathways. And it's a discipline. It absolutely has everything to do with discipline and consistency.
Absolutely. And being vulnerable is a choice. And it's a muscle, right, that you have to train. Similar to you were saying, you have to do it over and over and over and over again. And that's a very important point that I think we need to make, is that especially for veterans getting out, and it's so difficult to show vulnerability, and it is a group of people who are plagued by suicide, and a group of people who are plagued by the stigma that they can't escape that feeling in their gut and they can't reach out for help. Showing vulnerability one time is not gonna change everything. You're not gonna wake up the next day and be like, wow, like I'm all good. But what it does allow you to do is allow for growth, and allows you to keep practicing vulnerability and keep having difficult conversations and keep reaching out and asking for help. And then that can allow you to, like you said, change the pathways in your mind and create a new sense of truth and a new sense of purpose.
No, it's a really important point that you just made as well, right? Because when you make the choice to be vulnerable, and you're right, it's not going to fix everything, right? But it opens the door to the possibility of what could be, right? And that is powerful, right? Like when you really wrap your mind around, okay, so this is this new identity. I'm getting back into the grind. Like I'm trying to find myself again and establish that identity, but I'm not willing to invite people in, right? Or even break through certain barriers within myself, right? To hear like what's actually going on inside. It's almost impossible, right? Like it's exceedingly difficult, and it takes an incredible amount of time unless you are willing to look at yourself in the mirror and say, let's have a raw and authentic conversation about what's really going on, right? And just doing it once, man, it does make a difference. I've seen it time and time again but it's scary.
Absolutely.
Like, it's incredibly scary.
It's the hardest thing I think that anyone can do, and I think that's why the 38 challenge and what we need to do as society is that's the point we need to address.
Mm-hmm.
There are so, as you mentioned, there's a program to help every veteran.
Mm-hmm.
There really is. There's 45,000 veterans.
Absolutely.
They're like, it's not like we don't need more programs.
Mm-hmm.
We need to change the culture and the stigma. We need to teach people how to seek help. We need to empower people to seek help because it is literally the hardest thing that you can do. But like anything in life, the harder to do something, the more reason to do it.
That's exactly
and
right.
the more growth you can experience and the better person you can become and the more people that you can impact. So how, as you're doing and creating, your life's work and all the research you've done and resiliency and mental toughness, you mentioned that you have experienced trauma in your own life, right? And so I'll ask you to practice vulnerability now.
Sure.
And share what that story was and how it led into this passion and this purpose.
Yeah. So when I was 8 years old, I was in a car with my aunt and my 2 baby cousins. And my mom and my aunt used to kind of go back and forth with carpooling and picking us up from school because we all went to the same elementary school because we lived in the same neighborhood. And she picks us up from school. We're driving back home. We're about 200 yards from my house for her to drop me off. And out of nowhere, I see her head fly back. I hear a huge boom, and I see her head fly back. And there's just a sea of red that goes everywhere, right? Now, we're kids, right? And so every now and again, she would pick us up like a Happy Meal or something, right, for the toys and whatnot. And she did that day. So I thought it was a ketchup packet that had exploded and hit her in the face. I was 8 years old. Didn't know, right? And then I look up and I see her holding her face and there's just blood just shooting out, right? So come to find out, it was a 14-year-old boy who had gotten a hold of his father's hunting rifle and thought it was a good idea to target shoot at cars that were going down the road.
Holy shit.
So you can imagine, right, being 8. And I mean, it's all about vulnerability, right? So like, as we're sitting here, I remember to this day, like, the feeling of her blood coming down my face, the taste of it, like it's sealed, it's burned right into me. She was an ER nurse at the time. She knew exactly what happened when it happened. Like, I saw her head fly back and she's holding it and she's trying to put pressure and she's still driving, by the way, right? Like, and then ends up taking the car, puts it into, didn't make it to the driveway, went into our front yard into the grass. Luckily, my father was home that day from work. And came out, and he was doing something outside, and so he saw her, came out and got her out of the car, took us kids, put us inside, and that was the beginning of about a 6-hour lockdown that the SWAT team had to come and get involved. They thought there was an active sniper within a 2 or 3 mile radius of where we were, right? So like, come to find out it was this kid who got a hold of his dad's rifle and was never taught gun safety, gun protocol, that whole thing, right? So, the process for me and dealing and coping with that trauma, it planted a seed, as you can imagine, right? Like this idea of who I was as a kid, my idea of the world, this innocent place. It was all Disneyland and fairy tales, man, right? And then all of a sudden I just saw my aunt get shot in the face 2 feet away from me, right? So, I had to go through about 3 months of mandatory state-mandated therapy and with my guidance counselor. But it wasn't enough. What it boiled down to, I was showing a lot of anger, but what it really was I was scared. I was really, really scared, right? And what I was scared of is that there was nothing I could do, right? So even at 8 years old, like, what could I have done, right, to protect her, to protect my cousins, to make sure that didn't happen? So losing that was a really big deal for me. So my parents got me involved in martial arts, right? Like really hardcore martial arts at that time. I had dabbled in it a bit, around 5 or 6, but they really started pushing hard on judo and jiu-jitsu. And that is what sealed the marriage for me, right? As far as like what it meant to have that medium to help me process that trauma, that anger, that fear. And I recognized it, right? Like fast forward 15 years later, when I was working and rolling with veterans, right? I knew exactly, like I could feel that energy, and I like, that's trauma knows trauma, right? So like looking at them, rolling with them, having conversations with them, and seeing the positive changes. It was the same thing that I experienced, right? It just wasn't under chronic stress like the way that they were, right, being deployed out. But when you're exposed to that, and it's that extreme, right, as far as violence is concerned, your ability to process and cope is incredibly important. So for me, it was a medium that opened the pathway to what it is that I do, right, as far as the research side of things is concerned. So yeah, man, I'd say for me that from a vulnerability perspective, that is obviously that's the tip of the spear. As far as what I have lived in my own story, that feeds into kind of my why and my purpose, right? So, when you take a look at, and it's funny when I go back and I look at all the different chapters of my life up to this point, being able to push hard, right, on being a quote unquote protector, right, being able to push hard, and this idea of I have to be there, right? If I'm not there, right, something's going to happen, and if I'm not there to protect my loved one when that happens, I'll never forgive myself. That's the demon I battle now, right? Like, so I'm not Superman. Especially as you get older, you realize, like, man, I can't be everywhere all at the same time. But it's a battle for me because I feel like I need to be. I should be, right? So, like, a prime example, right now, my wife and I were here in Dallas. Our home is Tampa. My little girl's at home with my parents, right? Like, I feel like I should be there, and not just for her, but also my parents as well. They're older, right? But these are the battles, right? Little things like that they bother me still to this day. But the root of it comes from that experience, without a doubt.
So how do you deal with those battles now?
Yeah.
How does vulnerability play a part when you have those, those thoughts back to your childhood and knowing? I mean, you have a great sense of awareness of where it comes from, right? And your need to protect and your need to be strong. How do you combat those feelings of inadequacy now?
Yeah. It's an ebb and flow. There are days that I will recognize it immediately, but how well I can actually navigate it and deal with it, it shifts from one day to another. But what I will tell you is that when I feel myself getting to a place where I'm starting to redline, I'll make it a point to stop. And I'm a huge proponent of meditation. Like getting into meditative state is a huge deal for me. And just recentering and refocusing and rebalancing and understanding that, look, at the end of the day, you've done everything that you can, right? And there's, outside of you putting on a cape that has an S on it, right, and being from a different planet, there's no way. It's just not feasible. So don't put that expectation on yourself, right? But it's hard. It's a very difficult thing. So I think for me, the checks and balances really comes into play is knowing my red line. And when I start to feel that red line, taking a step back. And what does a step back look like? Isolation. Like, I need to be by myself for a good 10, 15, 20 minutes and complete silence and breathe and kind of process through and think, why you're feeling this way, right? So grab a hold of it and control it, right? And put it in line.
When did you start meditating?
It was probably 12.
When you started?
Yeah, 12, 13.
Yeah, I'll be honest, man. There's this long period of time within the past year where I was meditating every day.
That's awesome.
And it was awesome.
It changes things, right?
It does. Your mental clarity, your energy, your focus, your purpose. Yeah. It's all so much better. And then I didn't actually realize that until this week. It's funny, we're having this conversation. I haven't been meditating. And what you see in your life is you see a lot of anxiety, a lot of panic, and a lot of, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough this, I don't have enough of that. But I love that response that you have, which is once you feel that sense of when you are redlining, going back to that equilibrium, right? That point of you got nowhere else to be, you got nothing else to do, and it resets you. And that I will say, I just being vulnerable have not been meditating it, and I preach it, man, because I know how beneficial it'll be. And this week is the week that I realized that I was like, dude, you're not doing good mentally. And a big reason, I think, is because I've just been go and have not been allowing myself to meditate. So that's why I asked, when did you start doing that? And I think that is such a key part of mental health.
It's massive. Yeah. Like truly, right? When you go through, and there's so many different schools and thoughts, right, on how to meditate. But the idea of carving out time for yourself to calm the mind, calm the spirit, and achieve alignment once again, right? Because that's really what ends up happening, right? You get misaligned. Like, things are all over the place. You're go, the grind, the hustle, it's very real. and your equilibrium just gets out of whack, right? And so like the idea, and you know, because you'll feel it, because you'll start veering far right, far left. And at that moment in time, that should be your trigger point, right? Don't fall victim. Don't fall into that closed loop mentally of, you know, it's going to be like a dog chasing its tail, because you're not going to get the answer that you want, right? So you know you need to take a step back, right? And when you take that step back and you're consciously aware of it, especially in the moments that matter the most, it's a huge thing. I will tell you, especially since you mentioned that you meditate on a daily basis.
Did and going to do it again after this, after realizing,
you know,
you're
gonna get a text from me next week and be like,
no,
hey, bro,
please, dude, hold me accountable. I'm dead serious,
I'm
man.
totally gonna do
no,
it.
seriously,
Totally
please do. Seriously. John McCaskill too, if you're out there, he's the wizard on all that.
No, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. So it's an incredibly important thing though, because it actually creates buffers, right, in your mind. When you do it every day consistently, the sensitivity of what you need to prevent yourself from going down those rabbit holes, it's there in a much more pronounced way, right? Because when you kind of suspend it and you let it go, and you don't have that constant checks and balances, which it does provide for you on a daily basis, man, it's easy to get out of it. It really is, because it requires you to do something that your mind's not used to doing on the day in, day out. You're a young guy, you're ambitious, you're motivated, you're making a huge difference in the world. So that means that your brain, like neurologically, dude, the rate at which your synapses are firing, it's immense, right? And so now what you're telling your synapses is stop, right. Just stop, right? So the Japanese have this philosophy. It's called Mushin. You ever heard of that? Mushin? So essentially Mushin means no mind, right? So it was the peak, the pinnacle of combative prowess and the warrior ethos back in the time of samurai, right? So like when you are in the fight, stop thinking, right? Like if you stop thinking, if you force yourself to get out of your own head and just let be what is,
damn,
that's when you reach peak performance.
That's sick.
Yeah, man. So I have a book I'm going to send you. It's called The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. And it is a book that one of my martial art instructors when I was about 10 years old gave to me. And I have read that book once a year, every year since the age of 10. And brother, let me tell you, every time I read it, I learn something new.
Heck yeah, dude. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's a really, really good book.
That's awesome. Got to get back into meditation. I'll make sure you hold me accountable.
I absolutely will.
One of the points you made, which I wanted to touch on, you talked about that S on your chest, right? That S on your back.
Yeah.
So one of Matt's superiors in the Marine Corps, they wrote my mom a note, and in the note it said, you know, Matt was a Captain America of the Marine or Captain America of the Marines, something like that.
Yeah.
And that's how I saw my brother, and I think that's how he saw himself, kind of like you were saying, right? Like a lot of, and especially these alpha male guys, right? They see themselves as, maybe not see themselves, but a lot of people see them as superheroes.
Right.
I can talk in my circumstance.
Yeah.
I saw my brother as someone who was unbreakable, as someone who was Captain America.
For sure.
And the point that you made is like, none of us are that, and we're all human, and we all need help.
That's right.
And we all need to reach out and ask for something. So what would be your piece of advice to doing all this study on what it means to be a warrior and warrior ethos? Where does vulnerability, kind of talking about or touching on where we were earlier, where does that play into being a warrior, and what advice would you have in that community?
So, you know, it's interesting, right? So like from any military law enforcement operation, right, when you're looking at strategically planning out, right, what the objectives are, what your strategies are going to be, what your tactics are, what are the attributes of those tactics, what are you always looking to do, right? You're always looking to identify and expose the weakness of the enemy, right? Why do you do that? To win the fight, right? Well, if I'm not in tune with my own weaknesses, right, and where I am deficient, how will I ever win the fight over myself? I won't, right? And so like the idea of, when you start talking about, if I know for me not being able to bring that vulnerability to the table, if I'm not doing that, if I'm making the conscious choice and decision not to do it, that's a weakness, right? Because I'm making a choice to not do the harder thing, right? I know it's hard, right? But that in of itself means that you're not willing, you're not up to the task to push yourself. You'll go push yourself through buds. You'll go push yourself through Q course. Okay, awesome. That's wonderful. But when it comes to that internal, that part within, that's even more difficult, right? Which, you know, I've talked about a bit. So, you know, when you start talking about from a warrior ethos perspective, when you're planning and you're looking at how you would defeat someone, right? And what it means and what it takes to win, how do you win yourself? As silly as that may sound, right? Because in a very real sense, there's a saying that's been around for a while, and a mentor of mine uses quite a bit, and it says, the quality and depth of relationship you have with yourself will always define the quality and depth of relationship that you can have with others. If I have not won myself, and meaning that I have mastered my identity, and I have that component of really dominating and knowing what my purpose is, I'll never be able to connect and have that authentic connection the way that I need to have, right, to be fulfilled and live that kind of a purpose-driven life.
Dude, 100%. That gave me chills. That was beautiful. And going back to your own battles in your own life, this feeling of being inadequate as a protector, and maybe that's, I don't know if that's a good way to describe it.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah, I think that especially when you're a warrior, strength is your ability to protect, is your ability to go out and be strong and kill, right? And all that is absolutely part of being a warrior, hunting and killing and being big and being strong. But to your point, if you can't protect yourself and you can't identify your own weaknesses and do the hard thing of showing vulnerability, reaching out for help, saying, I can't do this by myself, then how are you going to be the best at the other parts of killing, right? Of protecting.
That's right.
How much more dangerous could a warrior be if he went out and he killed and he didn't want to kill himself when he came back?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. You know, there's an experience that I had. So there was a point in time in my life where I was in the executive protection field, right? So like my mid-20s, about your age, about 20-ish, right? I lived down in Colombia, South America, and I did EP work down there on the private side for corporate executives. But I had the opportunity to work very closely with guys who were in the Colombian military and their special operations, their special forces, in a unit called La Jungla, right, which translates to the jungle, right? It's the jungle unit. And their job essentially was to go identify, seize, and capture land that had coca plants on it, right? And going after narcotraficantes and that whole thing. And I'll never forget, man, I was having a beer one night with one of the captains, and he told me, you know, we got into a whole discussion about resiliency, oddly enough, back then, before my research. And I asked him, how do you deal with the trauma, man? Like, because it's different, right? Like when the fight is in your backyard, it's like, I'm going to get up in the morning, I'm going to go to headquarters, and then I'm flying out on a Black Hawk, and we're going to execute this mission in 2 hours, whatever it is. And then I'm going to come home that night and go see my little girl, be a ballerina, right? But day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, it's a bit of a paradigm shift, right? Versus the feeling that you get when you are deployed and you are overseas, right? And you come home and their home is the guys that you're fighting with, right? It's a different feel. So I asked him, I said, how do you continuously like get up in the morning and you're being so good at what he does? And his men were as well. And for him, it was a much deeper experience than just executing a mission and then him having to pick up the pieces on his own. For him, it was a spiritual thing, right? And what I mean by that is, he told me, he goes, every Sunday, I do not miss going to church and going to confession, because for me, what we call that here, what you guys would call PTSD, right, in the States, what we call that here is demonios de guerra, right, which is demons of war, right, which means that either the men whose lives I took or the men that I have lost under my command, their spirit, it stuck with me. It haunts me, right? And so when I have that, the hypervigilance, the insomnia, the anxiety, right? Like every single time I walk into that church and I sit there and I absolve myself with that priest and I've given it up to God, right? I'm good. That's all I need. And so his resiliency factor, and he and as well as his men, through the roof, right? And so I'm not saying it's right, it's wrong. It's just a different approach.
But what it is you expressing and showing a sign of vulnerability. And it doesn't matter. And I've said this before, like it can be one person. It can be a stranger who reaches out to me and we have a conversation. It's that first step, but the fact that he went and confessed the things that were on his chest and in his heart, that is showing a sign of vulnerability. And I mean, if you're a believer in God, there's nothing scarier than that, man.
That's exactly right.
Right?
No, that's it.
I mean, that like that. There, who cares what anyone else knows or hear? I mean, if this guy, and a lot of times people won't confess to God. Sometimes I won't confess to God. And it's like he knows anyways.
That's exactly
you know?
right.
It's like
who you hide it. How you gonna hide that?
You're not gonna hide it from. But then when you do talk about the things you deal with, whether it's a higher power spiritually with it, whether it's someone that you trust or someone that you love, what you are doing is you are releasing those demons from, and you can't hold those demons inside.
We all have them.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, like, and that's the thing about it. This idea that it's my fight, I'll figure it out. We all need someone to talk to. We all need someone to help us feel absolved, right, of whatever those things are, because there's too much, especially when you care, right? When you care that much to hold it inside, thinking that you don't want to bother somebody else, right, with those issues, with those challenges, or if it's the type of thing where you don't have that connection, right? I can't tell you how many guys that I worked with throughout the years on the research side of things refuse to talk to any sort of clinical psychologist or mental health therapist, right? Like, I'm not going to talk to that white coat. They have no concept. They have no bearing of understanding. I get 10 times more therapy going to jiu-jitsu, right? Because but the way in which the relationship is forged, it matters, right?
And you can go do jiu-jitsu, psychedelics.
Yeah.
People go and have this experience through
huge thing now, man.
Yeah, people go and have these experiences through psychedelics. I don't care if running around outside naked helps save your life. Like, do it. Like, whatever it is. Like, but in all of that, taking that first step is so strong, and you have to be able to be vulnerable with yourself and have that first conversation if you're going to find it out, whatever it is that's going to save your life. And honestly, that's what the business we're doing, right?
Absolutely,
is having people take the first, whether it's jiu-jitsu,
that's right,
whatever it is.
There's so many mediums, right? Like, man, for example, like there's the canine side of it. There's equine therapy. There's play therapy and art therapy. Like, there's so many different teams.
And we talked about that earlier. And someone might say, for example, hey, I need help. And it takes them a long time to say that, but they take that first step of vulnerability.
Absolutely.
And they take that first step of growth. And maybe they go try jiu-jitsu, maybe it doesn't work for them.
Exactly.
And maybe they go try, but then they're like, okay, well, that didn't work for me. That didn't work for you. Okay. Well, what are you still dealing with? All right, let's try this. And maybe they try psychedelics. Maybe like, hey, that made it way worse. But they're being honest and they're being vulnerable. Exactly. And then they go to, let's say, they go, and faith is something that saves them, whatever it is. But what it allows you to do is go out and find something out there that will save your life. That's the important part.
No, without a doubt, man. And the medium, I mean, to your point, right, there's pick your flavor. I mean, there was two guys I'll never forget they were part of my research. And after about 6-7 months, though they enjoyed jiu-jitsu, it just wasn't doing it for them. One of them got involved in pottery, right, with his wife. And he's become a master potter, right?
Dude.
Like, it's incredible, right? Like the other one, horses. Like he gravitated to horses and equine therapy. And he's just a boss on a horse now. The way that dude can ride is incredible, right? But like, it's made such a huge difference. But there's a collectivity there, right? Like, his relationship with that animal, that matters, right? The other gentleman, his relationship with his wife, it matters. And they're sharing an activity. They're sharing a moment together that helps to kind of lower the barriers and have that vulnerability, right? Because that commonality is there. It's super important.
Yeah, man. Super important. So through years of research, and a couple questions to close it out.
Yeah.
So first question, through your years of research and being with warriors, right, and having these amazing experiences and stories, what would be your number one piece of advice for someone who's struggling right now? Yeah. Someone who's saying, I don't have a purpose. There's no reason for me to live. This vulnerability shit is so dumb, which if they're listening this far, they probably believe in it a little bit. What would be your piece of advice for them?
Man, I think give yourself the chance to really find and understand what it is that you stand for, right? And the reason why I say that is this. Most folks that I have had the opportunity to work with and talk to who have gone down that rabbit hole, right? And they're like, just completely have given up, right? They haven't given up, right, in the sense of, I have no reason to live, right? What they've given up on, right, is the fight, right? You're a fighter. You're a warrior. You don't quit. What are you talking about quitting? Like that's not in the playbook, right? But you have to give yourself that opportunity to sit there and say, what are the possibilities of what could be for my life that looks different? Because it all starts with what? One choice. Make that one choice to be vulnerable, to have that one conversation that's going to catapult and domino effect into other doors opening. But if you don't give yourself that opportunity, you're quitting the fight. And you're not, I know you're not a quitter. Listen, man, this community, no, it doesn't exist, right? And if it is something that has become that apparent and it's that pushing and it's that pressing, then there's other issues that have to be identified, right, and talked about. But for the individual person that's listening right now, who's going through that rabbit hole, give yourself the opportunity, man, to really open up the doors of the different possibilities of what could be for your life. Because if you don't do that, man, and you just cut it, understand that the ripple effect of what that means, it's not just you. It's everybody else who's ever loved you, cared about you, right? And that is eternal. Like that's an eternal stain, right? And so, and unfortunately, man, I've had friends that have gone that route, right? And I carry them deeply in my heart, right, to this day. And you don't forget things like that, right? I mean, it's just no. Yeah. So I would say that, man, hold on tight to what the different possibility could be for your life, and just give yourself that one chance. Right?
Oh yeah, man, I love that. So you're out on this quest. CEO of Ultraviolet Living.
Ultraviolet Living.
Ultraviolet Living.
Yeah.
What are some things with your work that you're excited about that are coming up? What do you want people to know?
Yeah, man. So I will tell you. So on the company side, right? So what we do there is we provide highly qualified nurses for folks who need in-home care, right? And so car accident victims, plane crash victims, folks who are battling cancer, right? Folks who have gone through, who have severe TBI, right? There's a gamut of things that we provide care for and health care for. So, on the horizon, though, on the research side, right? Like really pushing forward the work that's being done with Defy and helping to really solidify their place, which they've done an incredible job. But there's so much additional data we need to collect, right, for the positive impacts and the positive influence of what's being done. That's a really important facet. Another thing there is, I'm really big into leadership training for youth, right, and for young folks, for them being able to understand what is the recipe for resilience, right? Because, look, man, like life, the older you get, especially, it is a constant, it's a battle, right? And so like, what does it take to stay in that fight, and are those resources given? And it's one of the biggest pet peeves that I have, is they don't teach that in school, like public education, that conversation about resiliency and what it takes, right, to be completely grounded in who you are as a person. It's a very philosophical and it's a very deep question, but it should be explored. We should be having those conversations, because when we start talking about a lack of confidence, it's a lack of belief, right? And how many young kids, look at all the amount of active shooter type stuff that's been going on, right? Like there's a very real reason for that, right? And it's a few different ingredients that are involved,
right?
But nevertheless, though, it connects itself back to trauma, right? And not having the sense of belonging and identity management, right? So it's all intertwined.
Yeah, man.
So that's something that speaks near and dear to my heart in a really big way, man. So I'm pushing forward a few projects on that end to help get some facilities and institutions established to teach that to kids.
Heck yeah, I love it. I love it, man. Oh. So last question to end it.
Yeah, bro.
Love to ask everyone this question. So what does the 38 challenge mean to you?
Man, we have a mutual friend, right, that connected you and I. And this idea of that, what you have done and the way in which the 38 challenge has been rolled out, I think it's two things, right? So there's an individual resiliency component in holding yourself accountable, right? But then also, when you understand the meaning behind the 38 challenge, right, and you participate and you are proactively involved in it, to me, dude, it's hope. Right, like it legitimately, it represents hope, and it's a movement, right? I don't just look at it as this; it's legitimately a movement that what you're doing, to not just change the way that folks view themselves, right, but also the importance and the worth that they have. Because look, at the end of the day, their 38 challenge, it's part of a much bigger thing, right? That's going on. But every deposit matters, right? Every single one, every penny, it adds up, right, after a while. So that idea of building that collective consciousness, that awareness, right? And then having that accountability factor as well. That's a powerful recipe, man. And I wholeheartedly believe it's saving lives, right? And so, no, man, I think what you're doing is just beyond phenomenal.
Thank you, brother. Yeah, and feelings are very mutual. I knew when we first first had that conversation, I was like, gotta get this guy on a podcast.
Yeah,
like,
man.
dude,
I'm glad, man.
You're one of those guys that, you know, you're a soul feeder, as Clint would like to say. We're in TRG right now. You're a soul feeder. And I know we're going to do a lot of incredible things together.
Absolutely,
so
man.
I know this conversation will help a lot of people, and I look forward to hearing how We Defy goes, and I'll see you in a couple weeks in Tampa.
Awesome, brother. Much appreciated, man. I'm looking forward to breaking some bread with you. Get ready, man. You're going to get a whole entire big Cuban Italian meal.
Oh, let's do it, baby.
My wife throws it down.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Awesome. All righty.
All right, brother.
Yeah, appreciate it.
No, I appreciate you, man.